The whole thing stank.
The big shell. Is a big lie. Or at least, it kind of is. While it's a front for arsenal gear sitting below its depths, we're also told it's a fully functional cleanup facility. Big Shell isn't meant to be hidden from the world either. In fact, it even becomes a symbolic landmark. So how deep does the facade go? It needs to be more than just convincing at a distance. It needs to survive a closer inspection too. So let's test that theory and ask the question, how convincing is Big Shell as a real facility? So here's where it gets a little tricky. When visiting the many struts of Big Shell, we are drip-fed small pieces of information on how the facility actually works. If we call on the codec while on a strut, Rose will tell us what that particular strut is responsible for. But when we question where Rose got the information from...
No, I didn't use the database.
Huh?
I used a brochure.
So our main technical document is a tourist brochure. That's not ideal, but it does give us something very useful. A complete cycle.
Around the perimeter of the Big Shell, oil fences were erected in order to protect against any further dispersal of the oil. You see those steeples erected here and there in the fence? Those are piles to draw up the polluted seawater. Gathered seawater is carried to the pump room in Strut A first, and all of the larger garbage is collected in sediment pool number 1 of Strut D. This is followed by a two-step purification process in the Shell 2 core water reserve, in which oil is removed by microbes. Then it is sent to Strut L and sterilized, and finally once again carried to the surface piles and flushed back into the bay.
Well, now that sounds pretty organized. But what Rose just described is what wastewater engineering calls a treatment train, which is essentially a complete treatment process. You look at what's contaminating the water, then various methods are used to treat that water before it's reused or released. But the stuff that comes out of the water during this process, so things like debris, sludge, recovered oil and biomass, all need to be dealt with correctly. Every wastewater engineering book I've looked at has always highlighted this process as being just as important as sanitizing the water itself. On that note, you may have noticed that Rose's version tells us where the water goes, but not the pollution. Keep that in mind for later. Now, you'd expect it to be obvious to start at Strut A, work around the alphabet, and eventually reach Strut L. But as you've just heard, that's not how Big Shell works. Instead, it moves from the intake piles to Strut A, then to Strut D, across to the Shell 2 core, down through Strut L, and eventually back into the bay. So we'll do the same, and follow this path. But don't worry, we'll examine the struts that support the running of Big Shell too. Conveniently, we can visit every major part of the treatment process, but as you'll see, there will be some roadblocks, like locked doors or the fact that Shell 2 is an absolute mess by the time we get there. For now though, let's start at the beginning, the oil fence. This is a bit of a strange one. Oil floats. So as you'd expect, most solutions would be happening near and around the surface, usually through equipment called a containment boom. A floating barrier used to control the spread of oil across the water's surface. It also concentrates oil into a thicker layer, making it easier to recover. While they do have a weighted skirt below the surface to stop any oil escaping, this is pretty shallow in the water, and it's nothing like what we see in Metal Gear Solid 2. Here we get a huge fence, stretching deep into the water around Big Shell's perimeter, which for an oil spill is definitely overkill. Due to the nature of Big Shell's true purpose, this fence seems more believable as a measure to keep people out, as opposed to keeping the oil in. But any spill like this in the real world would be surrounded with a physical barrier to stop it spreading further. It just wouldn't need to be as deep as this one, or as permanent. A containment boom keeps the oil, yes, you guessed it, contained. But what it doesn't do is clean it up. That's usually a job for a skimmer. Skimmers can be operated from boats or land, but can be unreliable when hit with debris or choppy waters, which can cause them to collect more water than oil. While we see how the oil is contained here, that's all we really get. In the version we're told, it jumped straight from containment to pumping contaminated seawater into the facility, which isn't quite the same thing. So, no skimmers? Well, they could simply be hidden beneath the surface, right? Sort of. Skimmers can have pumps, belts, and other machinery below the surface, but the actual job is still to collect oil floating on top. Big Shell could be hiding that equipment inside the perimeter piles, but the game never tells us that. According to Rose, they simply pull polluted seawater into the facility. So is this already a big mistake? Well, in a coded call once Raiden reaches Shell 2, AECOM mentions that Snake has checked the facility over and found that at least some of it is genuine.
I had Snake check everything out. Sure, there's some facilities to clean up the pollution, but they're not running at full capacity. Don't you think it's funny that even though 2 years have gone by since the incident, they haven't managed to clean up all the crude oil?
He then goes one step further.
I think they're having fresh shipments of crude oil brought in to replace the stuff they'd cleaned up.
That's quite the accusation. I don't think AECOM is right here, but I think his theory does hold some weight to it. Personally, it makes me question whether Big Shell was ever designed to finish the job. Instead, I think it's made to look as though it's always working. I'm sure you've worked with somewhere before where they always look busy, but never actually get any work done. That's what I think Big Shell is doing. But the fact that the oil still hasn't been dealt with after 2 years doesn't mean much. Large oil spill responses like this can take a long time, with the following environmental restoration potentially lasting much longer. Just look at the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that the cleanup itself took years, with restoration expected to continue for decades. Metal Gear Solid 2 itself actually touches on this too. In an optional call about seagulls nesting around Strut A, the Colonel points out that finishing the oil cleanup doesn't mean the wider environmental restoration is finished too.
I see a lot of birds over there. The tanker accident 2 years ago released crude oil containing massive quantities of endocrine disruptors. The fish that absorbed them were then eaten by seagulls, which further concentrated the endocrine disruptors in their bodies. What sort of outcome this will lead to is still currently under review and is yet unclear. It just goes to show that finishing the cleanup of ocean oil spills does not mean that environmental restoration efforts end there as well.
While the main data expert advises us by reading from a visitor leaflet, it's the Colonel that makes this observation. Or I guess GW does? Anyway, we already know that the environmental restoration was never Big Shell's true purpose. It may just be that, despite the real equipment here, it's being operated in a way that would never allow the cleanup to end. So for now, the missing skimmers aren't a smoking gun. They're more like a suspiciously oil-covered question mark. Let's look at what Big Shell does use instead. The perimeter piles. Rose calls these structures piles. If you ask an actual offshore engineer, it's a little confusing. In the real world, a pile is basically a massive steel leg driven deep into the ocean floor just to anchor a platform and hold up its weight. While these towers might be doing some of that heavy lifting, Rose explains they're actually the start and end of Big Shell's plumbing, acting kinda like giant straws, drawing up the polluted seawater from the oil fence. Then once the facility is done sanitizing the water, it sends it right back to these towers to be pushed back out into the bay. So they're Big Shell's structural legs, but also where it pulls the water in and pushes it back out. I'll stick to the game's terminology, so it doesn't get confusing. But from here on out, whenever I say intake pile, just imagine a giant perimeter vacuum drawing water into Big Shell. But are they using the exact same piles to bring the dirty water in as they are to spit the clean water out? Because if you dump treated water right next to the active intake vent, you're just going to bring that freshly clean water right back inside for another go-around. Real-world systems go out of their way to separate intake and outfall zones to stop this exact kind of recirculation. The perimeter is massive though, so perhaps some of the towers are designated ins and others are designated outs. But there's no way to know for sure. Rose's brochure conveniently glosses over this too, compressing the entire system into one vague bullet point, which is fine for tourists reading a leaflet, but it's less helpful for the poor guy trying to work out whether or not the clean water is completing a victory lap. But what happens before the water reaches the pumps? Rose claims they draw in polluted seawater directly from the spill zone. Now, we're not just talking about dissolved oil, we're talking about floating rubbish, marine life, thick oil slicks, and whatever else has been marinating in this giant industrial paddling pool for the last 2 years. Real intakes would use screening systems to block massive debris from rushing in and utterly shredding the pumps. These can be anything from simple grates to more complex automated conveyor belt systems. It's entirely plausible that Big Shell has screens hidden deep below the waterline, but this creates a paradox in Rose's story. She claims that the water is pumped all the way through Strut A first, and the heavy rubbish is removed later over in Strut D. So hopefully, the piles are already pre-screening all that pump-destroying junk, and not just recklessly firing raw, unfiltered ocean trash straight into Strut A and hoping the pumps are feeling brave. Speaking of Strut A, it's finally time to head inside to the mechanical heart of the whole operation. Rose describes Strut A as the facility's muscle, the pump station supplying the sheer power needed to circulate polluted water throughout Big Shell. Water does need immense mechanical force to travel miles of pipe and overcome gravity. It isn't going to make that journey out of enthusiasm. But does this specific pump station have the power to pull it off? With real pumps, you mostly care about 4 things: how much water it moves, how high it pushes it, how much electricity it uses, and how much of that power becomes kinetic movement. And we know absolutely none of that. We don't even know the amount of incoming water, let alone the pipe diameters or the elevation changes, so we can't convict these machines on bad vibes alone. But if we look at the overall layout, Strut A is quite convincing, actually. We can see massive repeated equipment assemblies with piping and electrical cabinets. This modularity is a good sign. Real facilities run multiple pumps simultaneously, so they can scale their flow or take individual units offline for inspection and the like. And if I've learned anything by making this video, it's that having a single point of failure is, to use the engineering term, a big no-no. Over on the north side is the control room. Ever wondered why this is one of the only places in Big Shell heavily monitored by CCTV? This is why. A pump station operates non-stop. You can't just flip the power off when it's time for bed. So you rely on networked and automated controls to sequence pumps and monitor things like pressure and faults. Articons claim that the facility is running below full capacity is a very real possibility with a setup like this. They could easily hold a few units in reserve to deliberately throttle the cleanup. But what about maintenance? Pumps, motors, valves will all inevitably break at some point. And real stations use heavy-duty bridge cranes to physically lift 3-ton machinery out. But inside this pump room? Nothing. Looking at it, it's not immediately obvious, or even physically possible, to lift any of this out. Even if they managed to somehow set up a temporary hoist, where exactly is any of the huge pieces of equipment supposed to leave? Through the door? I don't know if this is a glaring oversight, or something that hints at the true nature of the facility. Either way, you could argue that Big Shell was built to look the part, but the architects didn't think too far ahead. Their strategy appears to be, seal it all inside the room, and just pray it never fails, which isn't how real-world facilities operate. But what about the roof? Directly above the pump room is a fenced-off area, with numbered enclosures and a Keep Clear label. We can even see something that resembles a heavy-duty air-cooled heat exchanger. This is important for venting the heat generated by those pumps below. After all, there's some serious thermal chaos going on in those pump rooms. What do you think all that dripping water is in the pump room? I don't believe it's random leaks. It's condensation. The room is basically sweating. Don't be fooled though. These larger cranes overhead won't be pulling the pump machinery out either. Nothing is fitting through that door. As we found out earlier, the water rushing into Strut A is packed with unrecovered oil. Large, free-floating oil droplets are easy to separate because they naturally rise to the surface. But when you run them through a violent blender of a high-speed transfer pump, Well, those droplets are then shattered into microscopic pieces. Welcome to 8th grade science, by the way. This is called mechanical emulsion. Once emulsified, traditional gravity separation becomes nearly useless. Pumping the water isn't wrong per se, it does have to move eventually after all, but by pureeing the oil, Strut A just made the next step significantly harder. So it just aggressively moves the problem onto our next destination. Next up in the treatment train is Strut D. According to Rose, this is the first stage that actually removes anything from the water.
Strut D is sediment pool number 1. It's a facility where extracted polluted water is stored without being disturbed, so that its large pollutants settle and are purged from it.
Sounds straightforward, right? You slow the water down, let gravity do the work, and scoop out whatever collects at the bottom. But Rose is oversimplifying things. Sedimentation doesn't target large pollutants, it targets dense pollutants. A tiny pebble will sink, but a giant beach ball won't. So sure, Strut D can absolutely catch sand, grit, metal fragments, and heavy sludge to survive the intake pipes. But do you know what it's really bad at removing? The massive layer of free-floating oil. Because oil, yes, that's right, floats. Good, you remembered. So what's the point of Strut D then? Well, it still has a pretty important job to do. It needs to kick out the heavy, abrasive solids before they can wreck the more delicate, high-tech systems waiting inside Shell 2. Sedimentation is one of the oldest water treatment tricks in the book. Now, oil is tricky to deal with and isn't always perfectly well behaved. Sometimes it clings to things like sand or silt, creating a heavy, gunky hybrid that actually does sink. So Strut D might accidentally catch some oil, but only because it's hitching a ride on the dirt. Rose also claims the water sits here without being disturbed, but that's not really possible for a working facility like this. Water is constantly rushing in and out, so the real trick is slowing that momentum down enough to let the solids hit the floor. If the incoming flow blasts in with too much force, it just rips straight across the pool and escapes. This is called short-circuiting, since the water's taking a shortcut. To get around this, real tanks use strategically placed internal barriers called baffles, which basically slow and calm the water down, kinda like a speed bump but for water. We can't calculate if Strut D gives the water enough time to settle because we don't have the volume or depth and all that jazz. But the actual machinery we can lay our eyes on? I mean, it's pretty good. That central spinning rig closely resembles a circular clarifier. It acts like a giant, incredibly slow mechanical rake. As the water rests, massive scraper blades sweep across the floor, pushing the settled muck into the central pit where it can be pumped away as sludge. Now, we can't see the actual blades, but they'd be buried under meters of inky pitch-black water anyway. What we can see, the central drive, the extending arms, the machinery here in the middle, is just like a real mechanical sludge collector, and the game gives us a massive clue right under our feet. Remember the C4 in this room? The kernel points out it's attached to a specific access point. It's something that you'll gloss over on a normal playthrough, but here it confirms there's heavy service infrastructure hidden under the floor, which makes it all a lot more believable. So when Rose claims the pollution is settled and purged, Strut D actually backs her up with the physical mechanics. But it's not perfect. A real clarifier usually has a second mechanism at the surface to scrape off floating oil and grease. But once again, I don't see any skimmers. Its main job is catching heavy solids though, not picking up the slack for something a previous stage should have done. But again, where is all this removed waste going? Strut D proves they can physically collect the sludge at the bottom, but then what? It has to be pumped somewhere for storage, processing, or shipped off the big shell. We know where the water is going, but the pollution is just out of view. Maybe AECOM was right about Big Shell, but he was just looking at the wrong evidence. Instead of getting fresh shipments of oil in, maybe it's not going anywhere in the first place. But gravity can only do so much here in the sediment pool. So whatever's left in the water needs something more. Whatever survives Strut D now travels across to the Shell 2 core. This leads to the remaining oil being removed through a two-step process using microbes.
The Shell 2 core is where the actual filtration system resides, or at least it used to. Now it's just a shadow of its former self. Here, water mixed with crude oil was filtered using antagonist bacteria in the microbial decomposition of hydrocarbons. Below the first floor basement is a gigantic vat for this purpose.
Okay, the wording is a little awkward, but Rose is basically describing bioremediation. So using living organisms to eat toxic pollutants and breaking them down into harmless compounds. I know it sounds like one of those crazy made-up Metal Gear science things, but actually it's not. Certain marine bacteria like to think of crude oil as a buffet. So when a spill happens, these populations explode and feast on the hydrocarbons. This doesn't happen instantly though. They need time and nutrients, and if they're aerobic, which is when they need oxygen to survive and grow, then they need a constant supply of that too. So a gigantic vat below Shell 2, filled with oil-infested water and oil-hungry organisms, is pumped full of oxygen. It sounds a little crazy, but it's a real thing. What isn't explained is what makes the process two-step, as Rose says. The chambers are numbered, but we're never told what changes between them. It's a small thing, but it's worth noting. What the game does go out of its way to represent is the smell. So we're told the first floor houses an air purification facility.
The first floor, which is not flooded, houses the air purification facility that eliminates the stench from the polluted water. Manhattan is right in our backyard here, you know. There's plenty of reason to be cautious.
Real wastewater plants spend millions trapping and treating nasty flavored air, rather than venting raw sewage stench into the local neighborhoods. Hiding an enormous floating fortress under New York Harbor? Fine, sure. Making downtown Manhattan smell like ass? That's where the Patriots draw the line. Apparently. But then Vamp opens his mouth and completely ruins it.
That isn't seawater, you know. It's a byproduct of the microbes contained in the pool. Buoyancy is practically non-existent thanks to the high oxygen content. Once you fall in, you don't come up.
Right. Oxygen-rich water doesn't simply turn off buoyancy. Buoyancy depends on liquid density. Dumping extra dissolved oxygen into water doesn't turn it into thin air and sink a human body like an anvil. The chamber is still insanely dangerous though. It's flooded, contaminated, full of exposed high-voltage wiring, and there's a Romanian vampire hanging around. And he's got a knife. But the rest is nonsense pseudoscience. Luckily, Big Shell has another biological treatment system. But unluckily, it has so many legs. At first, the sea lice appear as a curious detail, but an optional codec call reveals that they're actually part of the cleanup crew here. Hopefully unpaid, and not unionized.
Look at all these bugs. The seawater is polluted with crude oil, and yet they can still survive.
It's an altered bug that can resolve crude oil.
Altered?
Yes, through genetic engineering. It was created in the lab to combat frequent oil spills. It doesn't exist naturally. The bug is genetically altered with DNA from a bacteria called Pseudomonas, which can decompose crude oil. It has an enzyme in its body that can break up oil, and was modified so it instinctively consumes any crude oil that it absorbs. One of the reasons the Big Shell has little oil pollution is because of this bug. It also helps in reducing costs and the number of spill maintenance workers. It's a form of bioremediation. It's for the most part innocuous, so no need to be worried.
Again, it's the Colonel who outdoes Rose and correctly identifies this as bioremediation. So it's true, Pseudomonas bacteria genuinely can break down petroleum. The massive leap in logic is taking bacterial DNA, slapping it into a sea louse, and then giving it an aggressive appetite for crude oil. Real sea lice are parasitic copepods that cling to fish, not free-roaming vacuum cleaners. The bigger issue is that these things are everywhere. They're not in a sealed tank, they wander through the dock, climb into Ryden's gear, eat his rations, and terrify Emma so badly she refuses to walk near them.
Bugs! I hate bugs!
Without stating the obvious, these are a serious hazard. They might be eating oil, but they're doing it wherever they damn well please. As microbes consume oil, they reproduce, creating a massive amounts of excess biological sludge known as biomass. You have to constantly scrape this biomass out to keep the system working. But in the version we're given by Rose, we don't get a solution to where that excess goes. Whatever's left now heads to essentially what is the last line of defense, Strut L.
Strut L used to be the effluent processing facility. It appears to be where seawater expunged of oil was treated with chlorine and other chemicals to sterilize and disinfect the water so that it could be made suitable for flushing back into the ocean.
Disinfection is pretty standard for the final stage of wastewater treatment, but Rose uses two very specific words here: sterilize and disinfect, which aren't the same thing. Disinfection means crippling enough dangerous organisms to make the water safe for discharge. Sterilization means nuking it until absolutely nothing is left alive. Real wastewater is disinfected. It's almost never rendered completely devoid of life. Chlorine is perfect here because it destroys microbes through oxidation. But you can't just chuck a bucket of bleach into the ocean and call it a day. Chlorine needs more precision. It needs a controlled dose and a long time to work, with proper mixing. The in-game environment isn't helpful here since we don't see massive contact chambers or dosing pumps. But Strut L is heavily damaged and mostly inaccessible. There's a few pipes here though, so there's that. I guess we kinda just have to give this stage a pass on concept alone. Chlorine is not a safety net for everything the previous struts failed to do though. If the water entering Strut L is still packed with unrecovered oil, or things like floating solids, then all that rubbish will physically react with the chlorine, eating up the dose before it ever reaches the bacteria. Worse yet, solid particles act like tiny riot shields, protecting the microbes hiding inside them. But if all goes well, you still have to take the chlorine back out before you dump the water back into the bay. Chlorine is highly toxic to marine life. Real facilities use a second step, dechlorination, to neutralize the disinfectant before discharge, which makes Rose's vague mention of chlorine and other chemicals extremely suspicious. But she is reading from a tourist brochure, and perhaps dechlorination is too big of a word for its target audience. And finally, we say au revoir and thanks for the memories as the water leaves via the perimeter piles. We'll just have to hope someone is checking the water has been safely treated before it's chucked out. And with that, we've reached the end of Rose's brochure. Big Shell follows a genuine treatment train, but just because you're using the right equipment doesn't necessarily mean you can keep a facility like this running in the real world. We now know that Big Shell could clean the water, but can it actually operate day to day? Where's the boring infrastructure necessary to make any of this work? Where does the recovered oil go? Where is the lab supporting the microbes? Where are the spare parts? What's powering everything? Well, let's turn our attention to the other half of Big Shell we barely get to explore. So these aren't simply nameless struts to fill out Big Shell. In typical Metal Gear Solid fashion, the answers we seek are contained on a disk. Specifically, the interactive making of disk, the document of Metal Gear Solid 2, which gives the surrounding Shell 2 struts names and designated purposes. Oh. Apparently, this half of Big Shell has been doing a lot of heavy lifting without us knowing. These are the missing pieces, but do they answer the questions we have? Let's start with electricity. We know that losing power stops the pumps, which brings the entire facility to a standstill, which is bad. So it's always a good idea to have independent power feeds and standby generators. So we know that Strut B is a generator facility and electrical substation.
Strut B is a generator facility that generates electricity for the Big Shell. The first floor is its substation.
But over in Shell 2, Strut J is designated as an entire power plant, which is a lot of power, but it also solves a lot of potential issues too. So great, power is sorted, but those machines will break at some point. A lot of this stuff is working hard and long hours, and sitting in salt air for 2 years, every piece of steel on Big Shell will have developed a close and intimate relationship with corrosion. But don't worry, Big Shell has a very good solution already. Rose tells us Strut E's roof is Big Shell's primary logistics hub.
The Strut E roof functions as a heliport, while inside it serves as an aerial transport hub for materials to each of the other struts. Because its sea entrances are cut off by oil fences, there is hardly any transportation of goods into the Big Shell by seafaring vessels. Almost all of the materials brought in are via the roof heliport.
Meaning it's more than just your Harrier's parking spot. Strut F is identified as a maintenance storage center too.
Strut F is the storage center. I think a variety of materials for maintenance of the big shell are stored there.
So combine that with Shell 2's Strut H, the warehouse, and Strut I, the assembly facility, and you have a complete supply network. Offshore engineering handbooks use helidecks, cranes, storage modules, and spare parts management as examples of essentials that must be designed into the platform from day one. Big Shell did not skip this. Rose might be great at following the water, but terrible at following solids. Strut D produces heavy sediment sludge. Shell 2 produces excess biological biomass. In the real world, sludge needs a completely separate treatment train, requiring thickening, dewatering, storage, and transport off-site. Seriously? This whole time there's been a dedicated oil processing facility sitting right there on Shell 2? Still, it doesn't show us the surface skimmers or the route to Strut G, nor does it explain how processed oil is shipped off the rig. But it gives us an answer to how Big Shell deals with the oil at least. Then there's Strut K, the biochem lab. Well, if you were worried if anyone was monitoring the microbial VAD in Shell 2, then don't be. They built an entire biochemistry lab right next door. Big Shell is the size of a small island, but it does feel empty. Part of that is the active terrorist takeover, of course, but the game gives us another explanation too.
Strut C is the residential area. It supports life at sea for all of the workers on the big shell. That being said, almost all systems are completely automated, so there aren't many workers to be found.
Strut C contains a dining hall, kitchen, and sanitation facilities. This fits with what we've seen so far. Strut A has a central control room. Strut E has automated cargo sorting. And Stillman even states that
Everything in this structure is computer controlled.
despite that, you do need some workers, technicians, lab analysts, and mechanics for maintenance and such. So we definitely need Strut C. But Big Shell doesn't get everything right. Cast your mind back to when Raiden and Snake discuss evacuating hostages. Raiden asks the obvious question.
What about the lifeboats? There doesn't seem to be any. Doesn't make sense.
Yes, Snake, you're right. It doesn't make sense. Under US Coastal Guard regulations for offshore platforms, manned facilities are legally required to maintain accessible lifeboats or life floats capable of evacuating all personnel aboard. Relying entirely on helicopters for emergency evacuation is a nightmare waiting to happen. The aircraft could be grounded, the helideck could be destroyed by fire, or a rogue carrier could shoot you down. So you're telling me that after building power plants, warehouses, automated logistics, living quarters, and a biochemistry lab, Big Shell completely forgot to install basic lifeboats? Or perhaps it was intentional, since there's one big lifeboat sitting below. I'll be honest, I am so done with looking, thinking, and talking about offshore treatment facilities and their logistics, fictional or otherwise. So let's end this. Does the Big Shell work? Yes, but not perfectly. We still have questions like where does the sludge and excess biomass go? Or what about the missing surface skimmers and lifeboats? But look at what we do have answers for. Honestly, it's a staggering amount of logical engineering infrastructure for a facility whose true purpose is to hide a giant frog-looking fortress under New York Harbor. But that's just it, isn't it? Big Shell isn't a fake treatment plant. It's a very real, functional treatment plant built around a massive lie. The cover story wouldn't work if the machinery is made out of painted cardboard, after all. At the start of this video, I said Big Shell was a big lie. And I was wrong, sort of. It could do the job it's pretending it was built for, but it was never meant to finish that job, because it had a more important one.